That night, I never expected the world I knew to splinter in half. The street was empty, washed in a pale orange glow from the flickering lamps when a sound sliced through the stillness, fists striking flesh. A man's groan swallowed by the dark. My heart leapt to my throat, begging me to drive past to mind my own business, but something heavier than fear pressed my foot on the brake. I turned my headlights toward the alley, and the beam caught 3 men kicking someone who lay crumpled against a wall. My pulse thundered as I hit the horn, the blast echoing through the narrow street until the attackers scattered like startled crows. I didn't know then that stopping my car would unravel every secret buried in my family's name. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt invisible in your own home, waiting for someone to finally see you. I'm Hannah Reed, 27 years old, born and raised in a small town where everyone knows your business and reputation means more than truth. My father, Robert, is the kind of man people admire from a distance. Sharp suit, perfect handshake, always closing another deal. Folks around here call him a pillar of the community. At home, though, his voice fills every room like thunder, his word final, his pride untouchable. My mother, Margaret, lives in his shadow, her softness worn thin from years of quiet apologies. When his temper flares, she folds into herself, clutching her knitting like a shield. Then there are my siblings. Evan, my younger brother, is the golden son. He speaks with the same commanding tone as my father, already studying law at his dream school. Every achievement he brings home earns applause, toasts, and photos framed for display. Claire, 2 years older than Evan, could charm anyone. She lights up rooms, floats through parties, and never has to ask twice for approval. They shine effortlessly while I fade somewhere in the background, a teacher who reads too much, listens too long, and speaks too little. When I was a kid, I used to believe love was something you could earn if you just worked hard enough. I remember being 13 painting a portrait of our family for Father's Day. I spent weeks capturing every detail, the glint of my mother's wedding ring, Evan's smirk, Claire's bright dress, even my father's proud stance. I wrapped it in brown paper and placed it beside his breakfast plate that morning, my heart pounding as he tore it open. He looked once, then laughed. "You're wasting your time, Hannah. Do something useful." The room filled with the soft clink of silverware and awkward silence. My painting ended up in the hall closet, half covered by boxes where it stayed for years. Mom tried to comfort me that night. She sat on the edge of my bed whispering that I was sensitive and that my father didn't mean it. But I learned early that in our house, softness was weakness. So I adapted. I spoke less, smiled when expected, and learned to disappear into corners. Holidays blurred together. Evan's trophies lined the mantel. Claire's photos filled the walls, and I stood by clapping when told. Even the warmth of family dinners turned cold when my father's gaze found me. "Stand up straight, Hannah. Don't mumble. Look at your sister, see how she carries herself." Each word left a bruise that no one else could see. Teaching became my escape. In the classroom, I wasn't the disappointment. I was Miss Reed, the one who could make Shakespeare make sense to restless teenagers. But every drive home brought me back to the same quiet ache, the sense that no matter what I did, I'd always be the shadow in a house full of light. I told myself it didn't matter, that peace was better than conflict. Yet even peace feels hollow when it's built on silence. That Thursday night exhaustion weighed on me as I left the school parking lot. The world outside my windshield blurred into streaks of gold and gray. I remember loosening my grip on the steering wheel, humming softly to keep myself awake when I heard a sound that didn't belong. I slowed down my headlights, catching the shimmer of movement between 2 buildings. Curiosity pulled me closer, and what I saw made the breath leave my body. 3 men in hooded jackets circled a figure on the ground. One kicked him hard enough to send a sharp echo bouncing off the walls. For a heartbeat, I froze. I'm not brave. I'm not reckless. I'm a teacher who grades essays and avoids confrontation. But something deeper than reason pushed me forward. My hand slammed down on the horn, the noise breaking through the night. The men flinched, turning toward me, their faces pale in the blinding light. I shouted that the police were coming. Maybe it was fear, or maybe luck, but they scattered, vanishing into the shadows as fast as they'd appeared. I ran to the fallen man. His gray coat was torn, his face bloodied, breath ragged. "Sir, can you hear me?" My voice shook, his eyelids fluttered, and for a moment our eyes met, his gaze full of pain, but clear enough to see me. "Thank you," he whispered, barely audible. "You saved me." I pressed a trembling hand to his shoulder and called 911, repeating the address through chattering teeth. The minutes stretched endlessly until the wail of sirens broke through the night. As paramedics lifted him onto a stretcher, I caught a final glimpse of his face under the harsh streetlight. I didn't know who he was, only that I couldn't walk away from him. I drove home with shaking hands and blood on my sleeve, unaware that the man I pulled from the ground would soon knock on my door, and that everything I thought I knew about my life, my family, and myself was about to change forever. The morning after that night, I woke to a gray light bleeding through my curtains and the faint hum of rain against the window. My hands still ached from gripping the steering wheel, and the faint smell of blood clung to my jacket where the man had leaned against me. I tried to convince myself it had all been a blur, something distant and unreal. I made coffee, hoping the routine would quiet the noise in my head. But the moment I turned on the television, everything changed. The anchor's voice was calm, matter-of-fact, describing a brutal assault that had taken place in a quiet part of town. A name flashed across the screen: Richard Hale, 54, founder of Hale International Resorts. My mug slipped from my hand, shattering on the tile. The photo that followed made my stomach twist. The man's sharp jawline, the salt and pepper hair, the same weary eyes I had seen struggling to stay open under the streetlight. It was him. The man I had pulled off the pavement wasn't a stranger. He was one of the wealthiest men in the state, someone whose name everyone knew even if they'd never met him. The report said he had survived thanks to the quick actions of an unidentified Good Samaritan. My heart pounded as I stared at the screen, realizing that unidentified was me. All day I carried the weight of that secret. No one knew what I had done. My father would have dismissed it. My siblings would have turned it into gossip, and my mother would have whispered that I shouldn't draw attention to myself. So I stayed silent. At dinner that night, while Evan spoke proudly about his internship and Claire laughed about her new promotion, I sat quietly nodding at the right moments, the sound of their voices blending into a dull hum. Inside, though, something stirred a small, unsteady sense of knowing that for once, I had done something they couldn't take away from me. Days passed, and every news update about Richard Hale's recovery pulled me back to that alley. I found myself checking the reports before bed, wondering if he remembered me, if he even knew my name. The thought of it made me uneasy. It felt like two separate worlds brushing against each other, the ordinary life I lived and the powerful world he represented. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about the moment he looked at me and whispered, "Thank you." By the time Father's Day weekend arrived, I had almost convinced myself that what happened that night would fade into memory. In our house, Father's Day was always a performance. My father liked things grand, long tables set with polished silver, the smell of roasted meat relatives filling every corner of the living room. My mother moved like a quiet shadow through it all, ensuring the perfection he demanded. Evan and Claire took their usual places beside him, dressed to impress, ready to bask in his approval. And I stood by the wall, watching, as invisible as the wallpaper. That Sunday, laughter drifted from the dining room as neighbors and cousins crowded around the table. My father rose, holding his glass high. To my children, he declared, his voice filling the space with authority. To Evan, who's already making a name for himself in law, and to Claire, who continues to make us proud. The room applauded, voices bright with praise. Then his eyes found me. For a fleeting second, I thought maybe he'd soften just a little, but his mouth twisted into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. And to Hannah he said, pausing long enough for the crowd to quiet the dreamer of the family, always lost in her little world. A few chuckles rippled through the room. Then he added, "Every family needs one, right?" The laughter grew louder, spilling into the clinking of glasses. Heat crept up my neck, and I forced a smile I didn't feel. My mother's gaze darted to the floor, her hands trembling slightly. She didn't stop him. She never did. I excused myself as soon as I could, stepping onto the porch where the air was cool and quiet. The sound of laughter drifted faintly through the door, but I couldn't make myself go back inside. I leaned against the railing, staring out into the dark, wondering if I'd ever stop trying to earn a kindness that would never come. That was when I heard the low rumble of engines approaching from the street. At first I thought a neighbor's guests were arriving late, but the sound grew louder, heavier, until it filled the night. Headlights appeared one by one, slicing through the darkness. I straightened, my pulse quickening, as a line of black SUVs rolled to a stop in front of our house. Their polished bodies reflected the glow from the porch light. The laughter inside fell silent. Curtains shifted as relatives pressed to the windows. My father stepped outside, his expression tightening with annoyance. "What on earth is this?" he muttered, his voice rising over the sudden quiet. The doors of the first SUV opened, and men in dark suits stepped out in synchronized motion. They carried an air of quiet authority, their faces unreadable. And then from the back seat of the lead vehicle, a man emerged, taller than I remembered, his posture steady, despite the faint stiffness in his movements. The porch light caught his hair, now more silver than gray, and the scar healing along his cheek. It was him, Richard Hale. The world seemed to tilt beneath my feet. He walked toward the house, a thick envelope in his hand, his eyes fixed on me as though he had known exactly where to find me. The murmur of voices behind me grew louder. My father's face shifted from confusion to irritation. "Who is this man?" he demanded. "What kind of stunt is this?" But Richard didn't answer. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, his voice calm but commanding. "Hannah Reed," he said, and hearing my name from him sent a shock through me. "We meet again." Every breath caught in my chest. My father looked from me to Richard, disbelief twisting into anger. "What business do you have here?" he snapped. "You can't just walk onto my property like you own the place." Richard didn't even glance his way. He lifted the envelope slightly, his tone steady. "I came to deliver something," he said. "The truth about this young woman standing before you." Gasps broke from the guests gathered inside. The night felt thick. The silence stretched tight as a wire. My father laughed, sharp and humorless. "Truth about her? You must be mistaken. She's my daughter." Richard's reply was soft, but it cut through the air like a blade. "No, Robert, she isn't. Hannah is my daughter." For a moment I couldn't move. The words didn't make sense, not at first. My mother appeared behind my father, gripping the doorframe as though to steady herself. My father's face went red, his mouth twisting. "That's absurd!" he barked. "Do you think you can walk in here with your money and claim what isn't yours?" Richard unfolded the papers from the envelope with deliberate calm. "This is a DNA test," he said, his gaze never leaving my father's. "The results confirm it beyond any doubt." He turned to me, then his eyes softening. "You are my biological daughter, Hannah." The world narrowed to the sound of my own heartbeat. Behind me, whispers rose like the hiss of a storm. My father's voice thundered, full of rage and denial. "You think some paper changes anything? She's nothing but a disappointment, always has been." His hand moved as if to strike the air between us, but before he could take a step, Richard stepped forward, his voice low but commanding. "Touch her, and you'll regret it." For the first time in my life, my father hesitated. The man who had always towered over me suddenly seemed smaller, caught off guard by someone who refused to bend. My hands shook, but I stood tall, the truth settling around me like armor. "I'm not your disgrace," I said quietly. "I'm done being invisible." Gasps rippled through the crowd. My mother's tears fell silently, her hand pressed to her mouth. My father opened his mouth, but no words came out. Richard reached up and placed a steady hand on my shoulder, his expression a mixture of pride and sorrow. "It's time you were seen for who you really are," he said. The night air was cool against my skin, but everything inside me felt raw and burning. In that moment, the life I had known, the silence, the shame, the years of trying to earn love, shattered completely. Yet beneath the shock, a new truth was taking root. My name, my blood, my story, they weren't his to define anymore. As the murmurs swelled around us and the porch light flickered above, I realized nothing in my world would ever look the same again. The days following that night blurred together, but the weight of what had happened hung heavy over everything. News of Richard Hale's announcement spread quickly, sweeping through town like a storm no one could ignore. Every local paper carried the story. Hotel tycoon acknowledges secret daughter. My name was everywhere, spoken in grocery aisles, whispered in coffee shops, printed in bold letters that didn't feel real. I had spent my entire life trying not to be noticed, and now I couldn't disappear, even if I wanted to. At home, the silence was thick and tense. My father's voice no longer filled the house. The phone rang constantly with reporters and former colleagues demanding answers he didn't have. His business meetings dwindled, invitations stopped arriving. For a man who thrived on control, the loss of respect cut deeper than any wound. My mother moved quietly through it all, her eyes red from crying, her voice trembling each time she tried to speak to me. One evening the phone rang again, but this time it wasn't a journalist. It was her. "Hannah," she said softly, her words halting. "I never wanted this for you. I thought keeping the truth hidden would protect you. I was wrong." There was a pause, the kind that holds years of regret. "I should have told you. I should have stood up to him." Her voice cracked. "I just wanted peace." I sat there holding the phone, unsure what to say. Peace. That word had ruled our house, but it had always meant silence. "I just wanted to be loved," I whispered before hanging up. After that call, I packed a small bag and left. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay in the house that had treated me like a stranger. Richard had offered me a place to stay when everything unfolded, and though it felt strange to accept, I found myself driving toward the Hale estate, a sprawling property on the edge of town, surrounded by tall trees and gates that gleamed like mirrors in the sunlight. When I arrived, Richard was waiting at the front steps. His expression held a mix of warmth and sorrow. "I didn't mean for it to happen this way," he said as he guided me inside. "But the truth has a way of breaking through when it's been buried too long." The halls were lined with paintings, the air faintly scented with cedar and lemon. Everything about the place felt distant from the life I knew, quiet, orderly, untouched by chaos. He led me into his study, a room filled with books and soft light filtering through high windows. "You don't have to decide anything right now," he said, resting a folder on the desk. "But I want you to know you have a home here if you want it." His voice was steady, almost careful, as if he was afraid one wrong word might send me running. I nodded, unsure how to respond. Over the next few weeks, I tried to adjust to a world that didn't quite fit. Staff greeted me politely, their smiles uncertain, as if they weren't sure whether to treat me as family or guest. I spent my mornings walking the grounds, the gravel crunching softly beneath my shoes, the air thick with the scent of pine. Sometimes Richard would join me, his steps slow but steady as he recovered from his injuries. He told me about the early days of his business, how he'd built everything from the ground up. "I wasn't always this man," he said once, a faint smile crossing his face. "But I've made my share of mistakes trying to become him." I listened, trying to piece together the story of a man who had been a stranger for most of my life, but now felt connected to me in ways I couldn't explain. There was kindness in his tone, something I'd never known from a father before. It was quiet, unspoken, but it was there. Meanwhile, the world outside his estate was less forgiving. My father's name had become a cautionary tale. Business partners withdrew, neighbors turned distant, and the same people who once admired him now whispered about deceit and pride. Evan couldn't hide his resentment. The last time I saw him, he cornered me outside the grocery store. "So now you're some millionaire's daughter," he scoffed. "Guess you finally found a way to matter." His words stung, but I didn't respond. Claire's silence was worse. She stopped answering my calls entirely, her absence like a wall I couldn't climb. Inside Richard's world, I started to see what he meant about beginnings. He encouraged me to come to his office, to sit in on meetings to learn. "You don't have to do this," I told him once. "You've already given me more than I ever imagined." He smiled gently. "It's not about what I give you, Hannah. It's about what you do with it." At first, the work was overwhelming. I didn't understand the language of contracts or the rhythm of negotiations. The rooms were filled with polished voices that moved faster than I could follow. There were days I stumbled, made mistakes, and went home feeling like an imposter in someone else's life. I overheard whispers from employees, some kind, others not. "She's just a teacher," one said quietly. "He's being sentimental." But Richard never wavered. "You'll learn," he told me one evening as we reviewed documents at his desk. "I made worse mistakes when I started. What matters is that you don't let them define you." His encouragement became a steady heartbeat in the background of my days. Slowly, I began to understand more, to speak up in small ways, to feel less like a guest and more like someone who belonged. Yet even as I began to find my footing, part of me couldn't let go of what I had left behind. The house I grew up in sat dark most nights, the porch light rarely lit. My mother sent a letter once, written in her neat cursive, asking if I would ever forgive her. I folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer, unable to answer. 2 years passed in quiet transformation. My life no longer revolved around seeking approval, but around learning how to stand on my own. I still taught part-time by choice, now finding comfort in the steady rhythm of my students' voices. Richard's health improved, and with it, our connection deepened. There were moments of laughter, small dinners by the fireplace, long talks about mistakes and redemption. When Father's Day came around again, it no longer filled me with dread. Richard invited a few close friends and some of his longtime employees to the garden for a simple lunch. The air smelled of jasmine and grilled corn, the table laid with mismatched plates and wildflowers from the yard. He raised his glass and looked at me across the table. "To Hannah," he said, his voice clear, full of quiet pride. "To my daughter, and to the journey we've both been given." The words settled over me like sunlight. For the first time, Father's Day didn't hurt. It healed. Still as laughter rose around us and the evening light turned golden, I felt a small tug in my chest, a reminder that truth once revealed never stops echoing. There were still things left unsaid, wounds that time hadn't fully closed. And somewhere out there, the past I thought I'd left behind was waiting for its turn to be heard again. The first few weeks after the truth came out felt like walking through a fog. Everywhere I went, eyes followed me. The grocery clerk paused longer than usual when handing me change. Parents at school whispered just loud enough for me to hear. Some offered polite smiles filled with curiosity, others turned away entirely. The name Hale carried power, but in a small town like ours, it also carried weight, the kind that pressed down on you until you could barely breathe. At night, I'd lie awake, replaying that moment on the porch, Richard's voice echoing in my mind. My father's fury, my mother's tears. There were questions that wouldn't stop spinning, how long they'd known, why no one had told me, and what my life was supposed to look like now. The silence that had once been my refuge now felt like a void, deep and unfamiliar. Richard called often, his tone patient, never pushing. He wanted to meet, to talk, to make up for years lost. I hesitated at first, afraid that stepping into his world would mean losing what little stability I had left. But one afternoon, when the whispers became too heavy to ignore, I found myself sitting across from him in a quiet corner of a downtown cafe. He looked healthier than the night I found him in that alley, though the faint scar near his temple reminded me how close I'd come to losing him before I even knew who he was. "I don't expect anything," he said, gently stirring his coffee without looking up. "But I thought you deserved to hear the truth from me, not just see it printed in headlines." The story unfolded slowly, each detail, a piece of a life I never knew existed. My mother and Richard had met decades ago, long before she married my father. He'd been young, ambitious, and always traveling. She'd written to him once after learning she was pregnant, but her letter never reached him. By the time he returned, she was gone, married with a family that wasn't his. He searched, but her new last name and my father's influence buried every trace of me. I listened without speaking, my hands wrapped around the warm mug as if it could steady me. There was no bitterness in his voice, only quiet regret. "I didn't come back to disrupt your life," he said finally, "but when you saved me that night, something in your eyes felt familiar. I had to know." His words settled deep in me. I didn't know what to do with them. Part of me wanted to leave, to run back to the world I understood, even if it had been cruel. But another part, a smaller, braver one, wanted to believe him. In the weeks that followed, I began visiting him at his office. The building was sleek and glass-fronted, a world away from the cluttered classrooms and faded paint of my school. His staff treated me with careful courtesy, the kind reserved for people whose names carried meaning. Richard never introduced me as anything other than my daughter. The first time I heard him say it aloud, I felt something shift quietly inside me. Still stepping into his life wasn't easy. The people around him, board members, advisors, even his friends, looked at me with polite disbelief. I didn't dress like them or move with the same ease. My life had been built on quiet effort, not power. Once after a meeting, I overheard someone murmur that I didn't fit the mold. I pretended not to hear, but the words stayed with me. Richard noticed my unease. One evening, as we stood in his study, he said, "You don't have to prove yourself to anyone. You already did that the night you refused to look away." His voice was steady, and for the first time, I believed him. Meanwhile, things at home grew worse. My father's business began to crumble under the weight of the scandal. He'd built his empire on reputation, and without it, deals vanished. Old friends stopped calling. I heard from a neighbor that he'd been drinking more, locking himself in his office for hours. My mother reached out again, her messages soft and uncertain. She wanted to talk, to explain, but I wasn't ready. Evan avoided me completely. When I crossed paths with him downtown one day, he barely acknowledged me. "You really landed on your feet, didn't you?" he said, his tone sharp. "Guess some of us have to work for what we get." Before I could answer, he was gone. Claire's silence hurt most of all. We'd once shared everything, but now she treated me like a stranger. There were moments I questioned whether finding the truth had been worth the fallout. But then on quieter evenings, Richard would invite me to dinner, just the two of us. He'd ask about my students, about the books I loved, about the things no one else ever seemed to notice. He listened, not as a man used to giving orders, but as a father, trying to learn who his daughter had become. The first time I visited his home, I walked through the halls lined with photographs and awards. The scale of it all felt intimidating, but there was warmth too, details that hinted at a life beyond wealth. Framed sketches from his early projects, small souvenirs from places he'd traveled. He showed me a room overlooking the gardens. "It's yours if you ever want it," he said quietly. I didn't answer, but the gesture stayed with me. Weeks turned into months, and I found myself balancing between two worlds. My days were filled with teaching and long evenings learning the business side of Hale International. Richard encouraged me to ask questions, to challenge what I didn't understand. Sometimes I failed, misreading a report or misunderstanding a term, but instead of criticism, there was patience. One night as I left the office, Richard caught up to me in the hallway. "I know this hasn't been easy," he said. "You've been carrying the weight of two lives, but you don't have to choose between them. Just don't let either one break you." His words lingered in the quiet drive home. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel invisible. But I also knew that the calm we'd built was fragile. Beneath it, resentment and jealousy were still growing back at the Reed House in whispers around town, and in corners of my own heart I hadn't yet faced. The night I fully understood, that came unexpectedly. I was leaving the grocery store when I saw my mother standing by the parking lot, clutching her purse like she'd been waiting for me. Her eyes were tired, but hopeful. "Can we talk, Hannah?" she asked. Her voice trembled. "Please." I hesitated, the hum of passing cars filling the space between us. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then I nodded. She smiled just slightly, as though she'd been holding her breath for years. As we sat in her car beneath the dim parking lights, she began to speak. The story she told was one I hadn't heard before, one that would change how I saw her and everything that had led to this moment. When I agreed to meet my mother that evening, I expected excuses, maybe even denial. But when I slid into the passenger seat beside her, I saw something in her eyes I hadn't seen since I was a child: raw fear. The streetlight cast soft shadows across her face as she gripped the steering wheel, knuckles pale against the dark leather. For a while, neither of us spoke. The air was thick-heavy with everything left unsaid. Finally, she whispered, "I wanted to tell you years ago. I swear I did." Her voice cracked. "But your father, Robert, he made sure I couldn't." I turned toward her, unsure if I wanted to hear the rest. She swallowed, hard eyes fixed on the windshield. When I found out I was pregnant with you, Richard had already left for an overseas project. I tried to reach him, but my letters came back unopened. Then Robert stepped in. He offered stability, a name, a life that wouldn't be judged. She paused, her fingers trembling against the wheel. When Richard came back, I was already married. Your father told me that if I ever said a word about you being another man's child, he'd destroy Richard's career and mine. I believed him. Her breath hitched. He never forgave me for what you represented. That's why he... Her voice trailed off, but I didn't need her to finish. I already knew. I sat there staring at the dashboard, my pulse steady but cold. So much of my life suddenly made sense, the sharp tone, the disapproving looks, the way he spoke about me, as if I were a burden instead of a daughter. It hadn't been my imagination. It had been his hatred all these years hidden behind the mask of family pride. My mother turned to me, tears streaking her cheeks. I thought I was protecting you, she said softly. But I only trapped you with him. I didn't answer. There wasn't anything left to say. I opened the car door and stepped out into the night air, letting the chill sink into my skin. When I looked back, she was still sitting there, shoulders shaking, her face hidden in her hands. Over the next few days, I moved through life like a quiet storm. I still taught my classes, still showed up at Hale International for my evening sessions with Richard, but inside, everything had shifted. I carried my mother's confession like a stone in my chest. Richard noticed the change. "You're quieter than usual," he said one night, closing a folder of reports on his desk. I hesitated, then told him what she'd said. He listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he leaned back, his gaze steady. "Your mother was frightened," he said. "Robert always needed control. People like that use fear to keep everyone else small." He paused, his tone softening. "You're not small, Hannah. You never were." That conversation sparked something in me, a quiet, unfamiliar strength. For years, I'd been the one who kept the peace, who stayed silent to avoid confrontation. But silence had only protected those who hurt me. That night as I drove home, I decided I was done being quiet. The next morning, I called my father. His tone was clipped when he answered. "What do you want?" he asked. I took a breath. "I want you to stop spreading lies about Richard," I said. "You've lost enough already, your business, your reputation." "You don't get to take anything else from me." There was a pause, then a sharp laugh. "You think you're better than us now, living off that man's money." His words came like darts, familiar and venomous. "You're still nothing without me." My hands tightened around the phone. "That's where you're wrong," I said quietly. "I was nothing because of you. Now I'm finally something in spite of you." Before he could reply, I hung up. My heart was racing, my palms damp, but for the first time in my life, I didn't feel powerless. I felt free. That moment marked the beginning of small, deliberate acts of defiance. I visited my old house and retrieved the painting I'd made when I was 13, the family portrait he'd mocked and thrown aside. It was still tucked in the hall closet, the edges frayed, dust clinging to the frame. I cleaned it carefully and took it with me to the Hale estate, placing it in my new study. Not as a reminder of pain, but as proof that I'd survived it. Richard noticed it a few days later. He stood in the doorway studying the canvas. "You painted this?" he asked. I nodded. His eyes softened. "He didn't see what he had," he murmured. "But I do." From that day on, I began to help more with the company. Richard introduced me to his team, guiding me through meetings and contracts. Some of the executives were skeptical at first, polite smiles masking their doubts. One in particular, a senior partner named Michael Thornton, a man with a polished voice and sharp suit, made his opinions clear. With all due respect, he said, during a meeting, family doesn't equal experience. Maybe she should observe a little longer. Richard's reply was calm but firm. "She's not here because she's family. She's here because she earned the right to be." I felt a flicker of pride I couldn't hide. Later that night, I thanked him. He shook his head. "You don't owe me thanks. You earned that respect yourself." His words stayed with me long after he'd gone upstairs. But even as things began to stabilize, the undercurrent of tension remained. Whispers still followed me about the scandal, about my sudden change in fortune. I heard one rumor claiming I'd manipulated Richard for money, another saying my father had planned the entire thing. Each lie stung, but I refused to let them define me. One afternoon, I stopped by the high school to drop off lesson plans. A few teachers stood in the break room, their conversation quieting when I entered. I caught my name, followed by a quick, awkward smile. "We were just talking about you," one of them said. "You've had quite a year." Her tone was light, but her eyes held curiosity. I smiled politely and left. Outside, I took a deep breath. The world could talk all it wanted. I wasn't hiding anymore. That evening, as I returned to the Hale estate, the sunset bled across the sky in shades of orange and gold. Richard was in the garden trimming the last of the summer roses. "You're learning to stand taller," he said as I joined him. "It suits you." I looked down at the petals scattered across the path. "It doesn't feel like I'm doing much," I admitted. He smiled faintly. "Courage doesn't always feel loud. Sometimes it's just the choice to keep showing up." His words settled quietly in me. It was true. My first act of resistance hadn't been loud or public. It had been a phone call, a retrieved painting, a refusal to shrink. Small choices, each one a step toward something larger. The night air grew cool, and Richard glanced toward the house. "Come inside," he said. "We've got work tomorrow, and I want you rested." I followed him up the path, the lights from the windows spilling onto the grass ahead of us. For the first time, home didn't feel like a place I had to earn. Still, a faint unease lingered. The world outside our quiet refuge hadn't forgotten us, and neither had my father. Somewhere beneath the surface, I could feel the pull of a storm gathering again, one that would soon test just how strong I'd become. The calm that followed my confrontation with my father didn't last long. In the weeks that came after, I began to sense small shifts, uneasy glances in the office conversations that stopped when I entered the room. At first, I brushed them aside, assuming it was just the normal adjustment of working under the shadow of Richard Hale's name. But then whispers began to surface sharper now, as if rehearsed. One morning I walked into the boardroom to find several department heads already seated. Michael Thornton, the senior partner who had once questioned my place there, was at the head of the table flipping through a stack of documents. His eyes lifted when I entered. "We're waiting for Richard," he said curtly. "Have a seat." When Richard arrived, the tension was already thick. He greeted everyone calmly, then looked toward Michael. "You called this meeting," he said. "What's this about?" Michael cleared his throat, pushing a folder toward the center of the table. "It's about the expansion proposal for our East Coast properties," he began. "There's concern regarding a clause that was altered in the client's contract last week by Miss Reed." Every pair of eyes turned to me. I felt my pulse quicken. "I didn't alter anything without review," I said evenly. "I flagged a section that conflicted with state labor law. The legal team approved the revision." Michael's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's not the report I received. The client is reconsidering the deal entirely." He leaned back in his chair, watching my reaction. The air felt too thin. Richard flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable. Then quietly he said, "This isn't Hannah's error. The amendment was correct. Our legal department confirmed it this morning." His voice was calm, but there was steel behind it. "If the client walked, that's a negotiation issue, not a mistake." The silence that followed was heavy. Michael's confidence faltered just slightly before he nodded stiffly. "Of course," he said. "I only thought it prudent to bring it up." The meeting moved on, but the damage was done. I could feel the shift in the room, the subtle glances, the quiet disapproval of people who didn't like that I'd been defended. When the meeting ended, Richard waited until the others left before turning to me. "Don't let this shake you," he said. "They're testing you. They always test what they don't understand." I nodded, though my hands still trembled. It wasn't the accusation itself that hurt. It was the realization that the whispers weren't going away. Being Richard Hale's daughter meant every success looked like favoritism, and every mistake looked like proof that I didn't belong. Over the next few months, I worked harder than I ever had. I stayed late learning the details of contracts and reports, showing up early to review proposals before meetings began. Slowly, I started earning quiet respect. Even Michael grew less dismissive, offering small nods during discussions where I'd once been ignored. Richard rarely praised me outright, but I could see it in his eyes, the quiet pride of a man watching something once fragile begin to take root. Still, my past wasn't done haunting me. One afternoon, as I was leaving the office, I saw a familiar figure waiting near the parking lot. My brother Evan leaned against a car, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. "Nice place you've got here," he said when I approached. "You fit right in." "What do you want, Evan?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. He shrugged. "Dad's not doing well. You probably don't care, but he's still our father." His tone was cold, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something else, resentment, maybe even jealousy. "You think you're better than us now, don't you? Living off someone else's money." I took a breath. "I'm not living off anyone," I said quietly. "I'm working. Something you might try one day." His jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. After a long silence, he said, "Mom asked me to tell you she misses you." He started toward his car, then stopped. "You should watch your back, Hannah. People talk, especially when they think you don't deserve what you've got." Before I could reply, he was gone. His words stayed with me like a small crack in the surface of calm I'd been building. That night I told Richard about the encounter. He listened quietly, his expression thoughtful. "He's angry," he said finally. "Not at you, at what he's lost. You don't owe him anything, but don't let his bitterness become your burden." For a while, life returned to its steady rhythm. My work grew stronger, my confidence steadier. Richard began involving me in larger decisions, partnerships, budgets, even charitable initiatives. For the first time, I felt capable of standing beside him, not behind him. But calm has a way of drawing out storms. One Monday morning, Richard didn't show up to the office. I assumed he was at a meeting until his assistant, a kind woman named Janet Wells, came into my office, her face pale. "He's in the hospital," she said quietly. "They think it's his heart." I don't remember the drive there, just the sound of my pulse in my ears and the blur of traffic lights flashing past. When I reached the hospital, the sterile smell of antiseptic filled the hallway. Richard was resting, tubes running from his arm monitors, beeping softly beside him. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, the color drained from his face. The doctor, a calm man named Dr. Collins, explained that it had been a mild heart attack. "He needs rest and reduced stress," he said. "No work for at least a few weeks." Richard tried to joke when he saw me. "Guess I'm not invincible after all," he said with a weak smile. But when I reached for his hand, his grip was faint. "You'll have to handle things for a while," he murmured. "Keep them steady. I promised I would." The days that followed were a blur of responsibility. I handled meetings, reviewed contracts, and fielded press inquiries about his health. Michael offered to help, though his tone carried the faint edge of skepticism. "If you need guidance," he said, "I've been doing this a long time." "I'll manage," I told him. But managing meant sleepless nights and long days. Every decision felt like a test, every word in a report like it could tip the balance. The staff was polite, but I could feel the quiet uncertainty in their eyes. Was I capable, or was I just filling a chair? One evening after the office emptied, I sat in Richard's chair and looked out at the skyline through his window. The city lights shimmered against the glass reflections, blending like watercolor. I thought of everything that had brought me here, the nights of silence in my father's house, the whispers, the fear, the courage it had taken just to speak my name aloud. When I finally left the office, the parking lot was empty. The air was cool, the sky streaked with the last traces of sunset. I started my car and caught my reflection in the mirror, tired, yes, but stronger than I'd ever been. That night as I drove home, my phone buzzed with a message from Janet Richards awake and asking for you. I turned the car around and headed back toward the hospital. Somewhere between the soft hum of the tires and the rhythm of the road, I realized the truth of what Richard had once told me. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's just the steady choice to keep going. When I walked into his room, he was sitting upright, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You handled it," he said softly. "I knew you would." I sat beside him, the hum of the monitors steady in the background. For the first time in years, I felt a quiet sense of belonging, not borrowed, not forced, but earned. Still in the back of my mind, I could feel it again, the slow ripple of unrest, the warning of something unseen. The storm wasn't gone. It was waiting, Richard's recovery was slower than he wanted, but within weeks he was back to pacing the hospital corridors in defiance of every doctor's order. I visited daily, bringing updates from the office and pretending not to notice how tired he looked when the nurses weren't watching. One afternoon, as I read him the latest reports, he set down his glasses and said, "You've done more than hold things together, Hannah. You've earned your place here." His words settled quietly between us. For once, I didn't argue. When he was finally discharged, the press gathered outside, flashing cameras as we walked to the car. I heard my name shouted among the questions, some curious, some cruel. The story of the long-lost daughter still hadn't faded, and neither had the gossip that followed it. Richard squeezed my hand gently as we passed through the crowd. "Let them talk," he said under his breath. "The truth has already outlasted the noise." Back at the company, I found myself carrying more responsibility than ever. Richard worked from home for a while, trusting me to manage board meetings and finalize deals. For the first time, no one questioned my seat at the table. Even Michael's tone softened his earlier skepticism, replaced by measured respect. Yet just as the pieces seemed to fall into place, something unexpected arrived, an envelope cream-colored and unmarked, sitting on my desk one morning. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The letter was from a law firm representing my father, Robert Reed. He was filing a claim against Richard Hale alleging intentional defamation and interference with familial relations. The language was formal, but the message was clear. He was trying to drag Richard through the mud one last time, and by extension me. When I showed Richard the letter that evening, his expression stayed calm, though I could see the faint tightening of his jaw. "He's grasping for control," he said. "He's lost everything else." He placed the paper on the table and leaned back. "We'll handle it legally. But Hannah, I want you to know you don't have to face this man again." I nodded, though part of me knew it wasn't over. My father had always found ways to twist the truth to make himself the victim. This lawsuit wasn't about money or reputation, it was revenge. The weeks that followed were filled with depositions and meetings with attorneys. Margaret reached out again, her messages sounding more desperate. "He's not well," she said in one voicemail. "He's angry all the time, drinking more than he should. Please, just let him talk to you once." I never responded. When the court date arrived, the air inside the small courthouse felt heavy. Reporters lined the hallway, their cameras waiting. Richard's lawyers moved with quiet confidence, their briefcases polished, their tone professional. My father sat at the opposite table, his suit wrinkled, his expression hard. My mother sat behind him, her eyes red-rimmed and fixed on the floor. The proceedings lasted hours. My father's attorney argued that Richard's public acknowledgement of me had irreparably damaged the Reed family's social standing and distorted the perception of lineage. The phrasing made my stomach twist. When it was Richard's turn to speak, his voice was calm and measured. "I told the truth," he said. "That's not defamation. That's integrity." When my name was called to the stand, the room went silent. I swore an oath and sat down, my palms damp against the wood. My father's attorney asked question after question about the night in the alley, about my relationship with Richard, about my upbringing in the Reed home. I answered as plainly as I could, each word measured. Then came the question I'd feared. "Miss Reed, would you say your father mistreated you growing up?" For a moment the courtroom blurred. I looked at my father, his glare sharp, his jaw locked. Every insult, every cruel laugh, every time he'd called me a disappointment flickered through my memory. I took a breath. He didn't have to say much for me to know I wasn't wanted. I said quietly, "But I survived it, and I forgive him. I just won't go back." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. My father's lawyer hesitated, then sat down. The ruling came swiftly. The judge dismissed the case entirely, calling it frivolous and retaliatory. My father's expression darkened, but he said nothing. Margaret reached for his arm as the gavel struck, but he pulled away, standing abruptly before storming out. I watched him go, feeling no victory, just the quiet weight of finality. Outside, the press swarmed again, cameras flashing, microphones pushed forward. Richard shielded me with his arm as we walked to the car. "You did well," he said softly. "You spoke the truth with grace. That's something your father never learned to do." That night I sat in the garden behind the Hale estate, the sound of crickets rising through the warm air. For years I dreamed of moments like this, not triumph exactly, but peace. I thought of my mother, her quiet apologies, of Evan and Claire who hadn't spoken to me since the truth came out, of the girl I used to be painting portraits no one wanted. For the first time, I didn't feel invisible. A week later, a letter arrived from my mother. Inside was a short note in her familiar handwriting. "I don't expect forgiveness," it read, "but I wanted you to know your father moved out. He couldn't stay in that house anymore. I hope someday you'll come home, not to that place, but to me." I folded the letter and tucked it away. The wounds between us would take time, but for once I believed time might actually help. At work, life slowly returned to normal. The lawsuit faded from headlines, replaced by new stories, new scandals. Richard was back in meetings, his health stronger, his confidence fully restored. One afternoon, as I presented a new partnership proposal, he stopped me mid-sentence. "You've grown into this," he said with a faint smile. "You're not standing in anyone's shadow anymore." I looked around the room at the faces that once doubted me, now listening, taking notes, waiting for my next words. "Thank you," I said, "for believing in me when I didn't know how to believe in myself." He shook his head gently. "You already had it in you. I just reminded you where to look." The moment felt simple, but it carried the weight of everything that had led here: the pain, the revelation, the quiet strength forged from years of being unseen. That evening, as the office lights dimmed and the city glowed beyond the windows, I thought of how much had changed. The girl who once sat silently at her family's dinner table, the one who hid her art in closets, was gone. In her place stood someone who had faced every truth and still chosen to rise. But even in that peace, I knew there was one final step left, a closing of the circle that had begun in an alley on a cold night. Father's Day was approaching again, and this time I knew exactly where I needed to be. Father's Day came again 2 years after everything had changed. The morning light spilled through the windows of Richard's home, soft and golden, touching the edge of the dining table, where fresh flowers rested beside 2 simple glasses of orange juice. There were no reporters, no murmurs of scandal, just quiet, peaceful. Richard sat at the head of the table, his silver hair catching the sunlight, the faintest smile resting on his face. "You didn't have to make all this," he said as I set down the tray of pancakes. I smiled, pouring coffee into his cup. "I wanted to. For once I get to make breakfast for you." His eyes softened, and for a moment I could see the man who had spent years searching for something he thought he'd lost. We ate slowly, talking about little things, the garden, his doctor's warnings about work, and how Janet was still trying to reorganize the entire filing system at the office. The conversation drifted easily, like old friends catching up rather than father and daughter rebuilding from lost time. When the plates were cleared, he lifted his glass and said, "To the one thing I didn't know I was missing." My throat tightened. I raised mine to meet his. "And to the man who reminded me what family can look like." After breakfast, we went outside. The garden had grown wild and bright roses spilling over the stone path, the air full of summer warmth. Richard walked slower now, but there was a steadiness in his stride that matched the peace between us. We sat on the bench beneath the maple tree, the same spot where he'd once told me I didn't need to prove myself to anyone. For a while, we just listened to the wind moving through the leaves. He spoke first. "You know, I used to think success was the best kind of legacy," he said quietly. "But it's not. It's the people who stand beside you when everything else fades." He looked at me, then his expression calm and sure. "You're that for me, Hannah. You always will be." The words caught somewhere deep inside me. There was a time when I would have brushed off a moment like that, afraid to believe it could be real. But I'd learned something through all of this. Love doesn't always arrive when we expect it. Sometimes it finds us when the dust settles after the storm has passed, and we're finally ready to receive it. Later that afternoon, I drove across town. The streets of my old neighborhood looked smaller now, quieter. The house I grew up in stood unchanged, white siding, trimmed hedges, the same mailbox that used to squeak every time I checked it. I parked across the street watching as my mother stepped onto the porch. She hadn't seen me yet, but her shoulders straightened when she spotted the car. I waved, and after a moment's hesitation, she came down the steps. We stood by the gate for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "You look well." Her voice was gentle, uncertain. "So do you," I said. She glanced at the ring on my finger, a simple silver band Richard had given me to mark my new position at the company, and smiled faintly. "He must be proud." I nodded. "He is." There was a pause. Then she took a slow breath. "I know it's too late to change the past, Hannah, but I hope someday you'll let me be part of the future." Her words trembled, but there was sincerity in them, the kind that couldn't be faked. I reached for her hand, squeezing it once. "Maybe we start with coffee," I said. Her shoulders relaxed as she nodded. "Coffee sounds nice." As I drove away later, I caught a glimpse of her standing by the mailbox, watching until my car disappeared down the street. The ache that had lived in my chest for years finally began to ease. Forgiveness didn't erase the past, but it released me from it. That evening I returned to the Hale estate just as the sun dipped low behind the trees. The sky burned in shades of gold and rose, and the air smelled faintly of rain. Richard was in the study reading by the window. He looked up when I entered, his smile quiet and knowing. "You went to see her," he said. I nodded. "We're starting small." He closed his book. Small steps are how most healing begins. We sat there for a while, the room dim except for the glow of the lamp beside him. I thought about everything that had led us here the night I stopped my car, the truth that tore through our lives, the years of silence turned into something stronger. I wasn't the shadow in someone else's home anymore. I was my own person, built from both pain and grace, standing in the light I had once been denied. As the first drops of rain tapped softly against the glass, Richard said, "You've come farther than you think, Hannah." I smiled. "So have you." The next morning, I woke early to the sound of birds outside my window. The world felt still, almost new. For the first time in my life, Father's Day wasn't a wound or a reminder of what I lacked. It was a promise of what I'd found. I stepped out onto the porch, the air cool against my skin, and watched the sunrise spill over the garden. The pain, the noise, the doubt they'd all been part of the path that led me here. I didn't need approval anymore. I didn't need to prove my worth. I had already lived it. If you've ever been made to feel small, remember this: your worth doesn't depend on who sees it. Sometimes the world overlooks quiet hearts, but quiet doesn't mean weak. It means waiting for the right moment to rise. Thank you for listening to my story. And if it found its way to you at the right time, share it, hold on to it, and never forget. Every ending is just another chance to begin again.